So you now understand that one of the keys to generating a qualified sales lead is uncovering needs prior to, or at least on your way in the door. And we showed you how you can do that using cold calling as an example. And to be clear, the need you engage with doesn't necessarily have to have anything to do with your product or service. It should, but doesn't have to. You could engage with another completely unrelated need, such as a need to be entertained, or a need associated with hunger, or a need for opportunity, whatever. But if you can't engage with a need at all, you're not getting in the door. Because remember, what everyone is thinking from the example of when they pick up the phone is, why should I talk to you? Why should I meet with you? And why should I buy from you? Or more generally, anytime you interrupt someone's day, the first thing they're thinking is, why should I spend my time with you? Why should I care? And for sure, if you have to explain it to them or you have to force them to make an inference, it's not going to work very well, particularly if they have an easy way to disengage. But if you can engage with them, which you can normally do if you can trigger a need, and if you can then uncover a need you can address, it makes for a better lead and it's more likely to close successfully, profitably, and quickly. So whether you're selling a car where there might be needs associated with transportation, status, economics, or the environment, or you're selling software development where there might be needs associated with functionality, the user experience, cost, or timing, or you're selling toothpaste where there might be a need for healthier teeth or being more attractive to the opposite sex, being able to identify, target, and leverage those needs is always going to be one of the keys to success. Given the power of needs to drive engagement, you have to ask, how can you justify any marketing or sales program that didn't directly address the issue of targeting predetermined needs and uncovering personalized needs as part of the lead generation process? I have no idea, but evidently the platforms, the solution providers, marketing professionals, and thousands of agencies must believe that you've already got it covered because virtually nothing they do talks about it or helps businesses address the issue. Just take a look at most websites. They're typically all about features or at best advantages, but they rarely focus on the needs, pains, problems, and unmet goals of their potential customers, and so they fail. So what we need to talk about is how do you get at a prospect's needs in the lead generation process so you can better engage with them and have the prospect understand better why they should want to talk with you, meet with you, and buy from you. In other words, and let's use a company's website for example, how can you ensure that it actually engages people's interest and that people fill out the form or trigger one of its CTAs? Or in the case of an email, how can you ensure that people will open it, read it, and click through? Or if you're using advertising or a blog or social media, how can you maximize your click-through rate or the percentage of people who subscribe? The answer, you now know, is another question. How do you engage with your prospect's needs? If you remember, we talked about how to do that at length using the example of cold calling, where we rang the prospect's phone kind of to interrupt their day. We introduced ourselves, we established rapport, and we delivered an initial benefit statement designed to stimulate initial interest that was based on the case histories about solving customer problems we had previously written. If that got them to stay on the phone, we repeated our IBS, we gained permission to ask questions, and then we asked a whole bunch of questions designed to uncover needs, create urgency, and build value, which usually resulted in a highly qualified sales lead. We're going to talk more a little later about how to apply that technique to other media so you can generate qualified sales leads in a variety of ways, but first we need to dive a little bit deeper on the subject of needs. Because remember, nobody needs a drill. They need a hole so they can put together a piece of furniture so that they can have a place to sit and watch the football game with their friends. As I'm sure you know, there's an entire discipline that tries to get at needs, and that's market research. To be sure, there are still companies that do surveys, polls, and questionnaires, primary market research to discover new needs, issues, and drivers behind consumer behavior and business decision making. And they can also do so with secondary market research. Think data mining to get at information indirectly. But most companies don't usually do market research as part of the lead generation process. Instead, it's usually part of the product development function at best, or when planning a marketing initiative. And even then, the utilization of these services by most businesses is so low as to almost be irrelevant, if not laughable, as most businesses are like the guy who opens a restaurant because people got to eat. True, but it's hardly up for a Michelin star or a Clio. Most businesses operate on intuition about customer needs, or maybe they have a vision about their unique selling proposition or their so-called ideal customer. two concepts, which we'll come back to shortly, that are completely useless in the absence of an understanding of needs. Anyway, if we have to talk about market research in order to get you to think about needs, so be it. In general, there are three types of market research. Primary market research is research you conduct yourself or you hire somebody to do it for you. It involves going directly to a source, usually customers or prospects in your target market, to ask questions and gather information, often about their needs and other attributes, usually to enable you to make better business and targeting decisions. Secondary research, on the other hand, uses data that's already been compiled, gathered, organized, and published by others, usually for some other purpose, but then you try to apply it, usually by making assumptions and inferences to your own situation. As you can imagine, primary research tends to be more expensive, but the answers you get are usually more reliable. Secondary research tends to be much less expensive because someone else did the hard part, but because you're making inferences, it tends to be less reliable. And so it can sometimes lead to erroneous assumptions and strategic errors, but it can still be valuable if you use it carefully. Ironically, when we're talking about asking probing questions during the cold calling section of this series, we were doing primary market research. We were gathering information on the prospect's needs right from the horse's mouth, as it were. But you also remember before that, when we constructed our initial benefit statements, we said we were making an assumption about what would be of interest and what would engage with the prospect. We based it on secondary information, especially our case histories, and our best guess as to what would stimulate initial interest, but as you may know from experience, sometimes we guess wrong. By the way, there's also a third kind of research, not technically its own thing, but more like a subset of secondary research, where you mine various data sources in an attempt to identify specific needs and attributes of your target prospects and market. And interestingly, generative AI is actually pretty good at this, and so you should consider using it. So now let's talk about it in the context of the lead generation paradigm. What we're talking about here is how can we devise an initial benefit statement or a headline or an email subject line or even a web page or an entire blog post that is as powerful, personal, compelling, engaging, and attention-getting as possible. Again, this applies both to B2B and B2C, though we're going to talk about B2B for convenience. That is, how can we come up with something to say early in the call or with our ad or email or homepage that will get the prospect's attention and interest reliably, that won't get a hang up or a swipe or a round file. And of course, it would be nice if it worked regardless of whether we were doing cold calling, advertising, social media, or sending out smoke signals. And secondary market research can certainly help. For example, most people like to check a prospect's LinkedIn profile before they call them. We often do that to confirm their role, title, and responsibilities. And we can sometimes make inferences about what would be of interest to the prospect based on what they've posted. It turns out, however, that while it's easily available, LinkedIn profiles and social media postings tell you almost nothing about what the prospect's needs or priorities are. Yeah, the platforms have been lying to you here too. And in fact, in many cases, if you use the information for anything other than maybe confirming their job function, you're likely to get a rejection. And there's a big reason why this happens. Very simply, people post what they want you to know. They don't show you the spot on the back of their tie. And so if they have a problem that they're having trouble solving, and I'm talking about real decision makers here, not people who post to forums to get free advice, they are for sure not going to put it out there for the world to see. The same thing holds for company posts and publications. Do you really think they're going to announce that they're not making their sales numbers without having a solution already lined up, or that their software development is 6 months late without already having implemented a recovery plan? Thinking otherwise is a classic rookie mistake. Now, there are some sources that can give you real-time information. For example, if a company is recruiting salespeople, they may actually need help in that area, but they could just as easily be running an evergreen ad, or they may have a process that works just fine. And so overall, we've found this method to be almost as big a waste of time as LinkedIn and intent data if you're trying to predict what their needs are. Not only are you likely to encounter a "we've got it covered" objection, but you're probably the 20th person to call with the same wrong assumption. So expect a hang-up. But I do want to talk about a method that can work, partly to contrast it to the dumb things that the platforms, solution providers, and marketing professionals tell you, but also to prove to you that there are solutions and they are very much within the lead generation paradigm. For example, we had a client a while back, a medical group who wanted to sell their neonatology services to regional hospitals. A neonatologist is the type of doctor who takes care of premature babies and, of course, their mothers, and this group was offering to provide 24/7 on-site coverage to hospitals that usually had an on-call neonatologist during off hours. As you can imagine, if an at-risk pregnancy shows up at 2 in the morning and they have to wait an hour or two to see a neonatologist, that can be a problem. Sometimes the hospital will put them in an ambulance and ship them off to a tertiary care facility, but as you can guess, that can be a risky proposition when time is of the essence. Despite that, when the client approached senior management at their area hospitals, every one of them claimed they never had any problems. Even if they had to transport an at-risk patient to another hospital because they didn't have a neonatologist on site, there were never any issues, and it was only a handful of cases anyway, or so they said. The client, however, knew better, or at least he believed he knew better. He believed that there were more than a few cases and that the morbidity and mortality rate was masked by the transfer. And so we decided to do a little market research. Specifically, we called area hospitals, specifically the night nurses on the L&D floors, and we asked them about how they handle at-risk pregnancies that show up in the middle of the night when there's no neonatologist available. And what we heard was stunning. Panicked families, unnecessary transfers, more than anyone imagined, and unfortunately, morbidity and mortality more like what you'd expect. To cut to the chase, we went back to the decision makers, but this time with the actual data from their own L&D departments. We were nice about it, of course, but we ratted them out. They could no longer deny that they had the problem. They were exposed, and so they let us in, and the client locked up the market. In another case, we had a client who sold building wiring, think local area networks for data centers. They had been getting beaten down on price badly, primarily because they waited until the contractor put the spec out to bid, and because they were a relatively high-priced player, they lost a lot more than they won. We recommended that they look for opportunities earlier in the cycle and maybe try to get spec'd in. In other words, find the person who was designing the data center and see if they could influence the land design. But when we approached the architects and designers, it seemed like the spec had already been written and they didn't need any help. So we did some research and went further back in the process. This time we went through public records to find applications for construction permits involving data centers. And guess what? We were able to find the companies who were planning to build data centers. We reached out to the decision makers and got the client in before they had locked in on the spec. And we found a ton of projects, some worth as much as $50 million and more. And many of them ended up getting spec'd and sole sourced. The moral of the story, of course, is that you have to actually find the person with the need, but if your goal is to generate qualified sales leads, you kind of have to do the legwork. For a quick final example, I'll use a case that's closer to home. As you've seen, we've been helping companies with their marketing and sales functions for about 30 years, and there was a time when we could just go out there and say, hey, if you need more sales, call us, and the phone would ring. But of course, that hasn't worked for a long time, mostly because there are now hundreds of thousands of vendors, if not more, out there saying the same thing. So we changed a while back to something more along the lines of, hey, if you're spending a lot of time, effort, and money on marketing, and it isn't resulting in enough actual profitable closed sales, call us. And the phone started ringing again. That's not to say that we don't have to shout a little bit louder to get over the din, but needs change, and so you have to adapt. Stepping back, the general concept is to define your prospects' needs, pains, problems, concerns, dissatisfactions, hopes, goals, and other drivers. Figure out which ones your product can connect with, and then draw the connection in your marketing and sales initiatives so you can engage with your prospects at the level of need, which you'll find is much more likely to result in them wanting to move forward with the conversation. Before we leave the subject of needs and their centrality to lead generation, I promised that I would touch on two concepts, the unique selling proposition and your ideal customer, before we moved on. And I want to make it very clear from the perspective of lead generation, not just in the context of the lead generation paradigm, but even if you use the marketing 2.0, just fix my marketing program perspective. These are two of the most useless concepts in existence. Let me show you why. If you ask most people, they'll tell you that a unique selling proposition, also known as a unique selling point, is a factor that differentiates a product from its competitors, such as lowest cost, highest quality, or the first ever product of its kind. So the question is, why is this useless? The answer is, if you're in the mode where you have to differentiate from your competitors, you're already too late. You've already lost the battle. Maybe you can justify a few extra points of markup, or maybe you can win a few marginal sales. But if you're trying to differentiate your product from its competition on the basis of some factor, like it's faster, better, or cheaper, you've already lost the sale and you're just cleaning up the mess. Think about it this way. If your goal is to generate qualified sales leads, why would you want the prospect to even consider your competition? Remember the spec-in example from before where we decommoditized the building wiring offering by prospecting back in the decision process? We didn't offer a unique selling proposition. We just found out who the real decision maker was and what their real need was and targeted them. I tried to come up with a way to illustrate this issue, and maybe this will help. Here you see a commonly used Venn diagram that shows you how to find your unique selling proposition. In blue, you have what your business does best. In red, you have your customer needs. And in yellow, you have what your competition does well. And your USP is where you overlap your customer's needs and does not include those things that your competitor does well. So let me ask, how dumb is that? Forget the arrogance. Look at the overlap between what your competitor does well and your customer needs. That's just as big as yours. Why wouldn't the customer just put you in a bidding war and see who lowers their price the most? In reality, it's probably more like this, and you've really got nothing. In other words, your overlap with your competition is probably a lot higher than you think, and if you're counting on something about your offering to differentiate you as opposed to something residing in your prospect's mind, like a need, you're probably going to lose. Ironically, many of the SEO companies will tell you that communicating your USP clearly and quickly is one of the keys to getting potential customers to convert on your site. It turns out that communicating your USP clearly and quickly is actually the best way to teach your prospects what search terms to use in order to find alternative vendors so they can beat you down on price. And instead of them converting on your site, they're much more likely to buy from someone else, someone who actually engages with their needs. Look, in an era when barriers to entry in virtually every industry are non-existent, where customers don't have to drive to another store to compare prices, comparing features virtually guarantees that you will be forced to lower your price or simply lose the sale. If you're going to do something to stand out, you're much better off if you can figure out a way to connect with your prospect's needs, not show how you're better than the other guy. Another concept for the intellectually lazy is the ideal customer profile. Now, I'm not saying that an ICP might not be helpful in targeting and list selection, but I will say that the way it's usually done is usually pretty pointless because it rarely addresses the issues of needs or positioning, which are what really matters. For example, if you look on the left, you'll see recommended attributes for a typical B2C campaign, and on the right are recommended attributes for a typical B2B campaign. If your goal is to find people who need your product, though, using stand-in attributes like these for targeting is going to be pretty inefficient. I'm not saying that it's easy to target needs, but you should at least try. Anyway, let's sum it up this way. Know what needs you satisfy in the prospect's terms the way they see them. Checkpoint that they exist, make sure they actually trigger behavior, and then articulate them in your promotional material and market to them, talk to them, and talk about them. Let me show you a couple of examples. Once you know what needs you satisfy and why somebody should buy from you, you can now create two of the most important items on your website. As trivial as this sounds, it is amazing how many websites don't have these two simple elements, but it explains why so many websites are ineffective at attracting traffic and converting it to qualified leads. The first element that should appear on your website is a Why Us tab or link. Remember what we said before. One of the first things anyone is going to ask or think is, why? Why should I talk to you? Why should I meet with you? And why should I buy from you? Why should I spend time here? And for sure, why should I care? Don't you think since this question is present in just about every visitor's mind already, you ought to try to address it? In our case, what we say is, if you're not happy with the performance of your marketing programs, if you're not satisfied with the quality of the sales leads you get, if you're not making your sales numbers, we can help. And since we've done our homework, we're pretty sure that these questions are likely to be triggering for people, our ideal customers, who have these problems, right? In any event, don't just talk about how great your product is. At least try to justify why someone should be interested in it in their terms. If nothing else, at least it shows you care. So then the other element, which just about everyone neglects, is a discussion of the needs, pains, problems, and unmet goals of people who typically buy from them. This one's a little trickier, but there are lots of ways to handle it. What you're trying to do here is to get people to self-identify as potential customers. You want them to see themselves as a future case history or success story. You want them to visualize the before and after, what it's like to do business with you. And again, there are lots of ways to handle this. Just remember, it's about them, not you. Going back now, the goal here isn't to show you all the different ways you can acquire information on prospects' needs, either in general or for an individual prospect, before you reach out to them. That would require an entire course on market research. The point for now is just to show you that you don't have to fall for the nonsense that it can't be done, or that you should just be talking about how great your product is, or that you should just throw whatever against the wall and hope it sticks. If the goal of a business is to make money finding and satisfying needs, and especially if generating a qualified lead requires that you find one or two needs just to get in the door, then doing your homework, figuring out what the prospect's real needs are, has to be part of the process. Try to figure out what they are before you knock on the door. Talk about them on your website and in your other promotions. Try to identify more of them while you're generating the lead, and leverage them so you can close successfully, profitably, and more quickly, because it's all about the needs.